What's on your playlist right now?
In my class.
Go to guilty pleasure food.
Ice cream.
Ice cream.
Hi, I'm Benjamin Weber, and I'm an associate professor of African American Studies here at UC Davis. I research and write about the history of social movements and about racial inequality. And I'm passionate about studying the past to find root causes and new solutions to some of the most pressing social and political challenges of our time, like undoing the harms of mass incarceration and reimagining the future of human rights.
Well, Ben, welcome to Face to Face. Thank you for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And congratulations on your new book, by the way. I understand it had a very successful debut, and thanks for the copy.
Yeah, absolutely.
So to start, I'm just curious about what experiences in your life led you to pursue this research area focused on racial inequality and finding the solutions to it.
Yeah. It was a long time in the making. The book was about a decade of research and writing. And, before that, I grew up in the Bay Area here and involved in racial justice and environmental justice stuff in high school. And I came of political age in a time when we were sort of waking up to the fact that mass incarceration was the social justice issue of our generation, and certainly, and then also when the U.S. went to war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so these two kind of major issues of our time. And I was really fortunate to have a series of incredibly wise and generous mentors, beginning my undergraduate college roommate. His dad is a Black Studies professor at UCSB for a long time. And then I just had a series of really amazing teachers throughout college and graduate school. And I had studied history and politics and philosophy, at Brown and Harvard and Oxford and all over. And I really found that all of my best teachers and mentors were in African American studies, and that was the missing framework for some of these problems, because it was a discipline that's both interdisciplinary and it takes racism and racial inequality seriously and really looks for root causes to contemporary social problems.
Mentoring is so important for all of us, including me. So I'm really excited to hear you say how important that has been in your own career thus far. And I hope you're continuing that practice of being a mentor now for your students.
Absolutely.
So in the book, we talked about mass incarceration a second ago, but in the new book, you're exploring the global history of that phenomenon. So how can we develop better solutions to mass incarcerations from a global lens?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's the question I've been grappling with because part of it begins with understanding the history, going back to the root causes to see it as both the problem as rooted both in the history of racial slavery but also colonialism, because some of those logics, some of those practices that work their way into laws and policies, we've kind of disavowed the history, the colonial legacies and impacts of the problem. And the other thing that the book does is it lifts up solutions from those people who internationalize the struggle. So one of those ideas is to put it in a human rights framework, to say, what do we have to learn from other parts of the world as we begin to undo and repair the harms of mass incarceration? So one thing that is sort of top of mind here in California is the reparations movement. And so, other countries have done this, have struggled with how to repair historic atrocity, how to approach it, and then to also think about this tradition of mostly Black intellectuals and activists who have expanded our understanding of human rights and what it means beyond the kind of standard UN definitions. And so that's one example of putting it in an international framework, is to think beyond kind of the limits of some of the existing laws and policies in any given place.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Not only have other countries done reparations, but the U.S. has done reparations,
right.
just not for the African American community.
That's absolutely
right. So it can be done and should be explored and done.
Yeah.
You also just went on a book tour.
Yeah.
I bet that was fun. What are some of the highlights from the book tour experience?
That was wonderful. I think the most kind of rewarding and humbling part of putting out a book is who you get to then share the stage with and be in conversation with. So I was really excited to be in conversation with some of the artists who did the artwork in the book. He painted these portraits of political prisoners and activists who were featured in the book. He's a New Orleans artist, Io Scott, who his dad has an incredible legacy, and he has an incredible legacy there in New Orleans, and he's a dear friend. And then actually one of the activists who's in the book, who spent 50 years in prison, was on book tour with me. And then people like, best-selling authors, my friend Clint Smith, who wrote How the Word Is Passed. We kicked it off with him in D.C., and that was just a great conversation because we've known each other for a long time, and he and my wife went to school together, and so it was just, it was the first time I was doing it, and so it really put me at my ease to just have a conversation, and then, but yeah, it was really a wonderful thing to be in conversation around these important issues, but also with some friends and then radio hosts and other people. That was, it was a little intimidating, but it was really fun.
It means you've hit the big time now, right?
I guess, I start asking you to write for Time and stuff.
That's right. That's impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah. Congrats on that. Yeah. As you've studied this phenomenon, do you envision a possible future where there are no prisons? And if so, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think that's been the big question of the last decade. So I also teach the history of the last 10 years of organizing. And yeah, I think people are trying to find less punitive approaches to harm, to kind of undo and rethink practices of targeted racial criminalization and these other sorts of things. And so, there are a lot of different visions and different kind of abolitionist practices. And one of the things that we do with students is help them think about clarifying their own theory of change so that it's really rooted in the everyday ways that people can be accountable to one another, that people can seek to hold people accountable without undue levels of punishment and creating more violence and more harm.
Because prisons are really supposed to be not just punishment, but rehabilitative, right? So we've skewed over the years more toward the punishment side, but there is an opportunity, I think, for us to be much more about rehabilitation and putting people back into the community in a way that they can be successful. And
that's one of the ironic threads in the book and in some of these histories is that some of the reform movements, whether intended or unintended, that were claiming to be rehabilitative ended up actually creating even more. So like the Quakers thought that solitary confinement would rehabilitate people because they would be alone and they would find God, and drove people insane, right? This idea of being in solitary confinement. And there's a chapter in the book about these honor farms that was in the 30s and 40s. The progressive penologists had learned this from American Empire, from places like the Philippines, and they thought, okay, if we give people more freedom on these honor farms and whatnot, but it led to a kind of net widening where because it was seen as less violent or less harsh, it became more acceptable to apply that to more and more people. And so one of the concerns with this idea of net widening is similarly around electronic monitoring. So if you can, put people on an ankle monitor instead of putting them in prison or jail, does that make it feel more acceptable to put more and more people on that type of surveillance? And so it's one of these kind of things that historians and policymakers and Black studies professors are always trying to figure out, is that how do we get one step ahead of these reforms that in name are trying to rehabilitate, but then produce both intended and unintended consequences.
Yeah, always have to be careful about those unintended consequences. So you started a project during the pandemic. It was called the Open Letters from Prison Project. Can you tell the audience about that and what came out of it? Yeah,
that was a really beautiful collaboration that emerged organically from one of our community partners. And it was, really kicked off by the Office of Public Scholarship. They had these grants to collaborate with community partners. So we asked the California Coalition of Women Prisoners in the Bay Area, what's the need? During COVID, the pandemic, right? We're hearing all these stories about people on lockdown in prison, not able to visit with their family members. And they said, well, we'll ask our members inside and outside of prison. And one of the kind of immediate needs was for forms of communication and forms of solidarity and care. And, people were in lockdown and they weren't doing their typical They weren't having as much visitation. They weren't having as much communication with friends and family. And so we did this letter writing program because people had more time on lockdown. And the response was that we sent in materials that we study in classes here at UC Davis, and we studied the history of open letter writing in the African American studies tradition and these different traditions. And then people wrote letters in the style of, James Baldwin and Assata Shakur and Angela Davis. And it was really beautiful. And we published a special issue of that. They've run this prison newsletter for 25 years now. So we did a special issue with them on that. And yeah, that seemed like a really meaningful response to COVID, something that we could do, something that students got involved in, and that people in prison really appreciated. And so we are thinking about what the next iteration of that will be, but it always, needs to respond to and come from the question of, what could be most useful in this moment.
Sounds like a really productive use of the extra time we had on our hands during COVID. So. Now, here on campus, you understand you've developed a new course on the Black human rights tradition. What do you want the students in that class to take away?
Yeah, we'll be offering that this winter for the first time. And so I'd like to say I was further along in the course development, but it's an exciting collaboration between the Department of African American and African Studies and the program on Human Rights Studies. And I think the big takeaway for students is that there is this tradition of Black intellectuals and activists, stretching back to 19th century abolitionists fighting slavery all the way up through contemporary intellectuals who have offered an expanded human rights tradition, so that it's not just restricted to what did the UN say after World War II, counted as the Declaration of Human Rights, but that people have used the language of human rights to fight for something much more expansive. And so one of the things we'll ask students is, what are the human rights that the 21st century requires? So that this is a living, we'll look to the past, again, to come up with a vision for the future.
Okay. And the first offering will be?
This winter.
Okay.
Yeah.
So tell the students that are watching
to
sign up.
That's right. Yeah. It'll be a fun class.
So we have a tradition here on Face to Face. We call it Hot Seat. It's not that hot. All it is I'm going to ask you some rapid fire questions, looking for a one word or one sentence answer.
All right.
You ready?
Yep.
All right. Here we go. If you could compete in any Olympic sport, what would it be?
Ooh, that's tricky. Basketball.
Why basketball?
I grew up playing high school basketball, and it's always been
the Olympics were great, by the way.
Oh man, amazing.
Snoop Dogg.
Amazing.
What can I say?
And Steph Curry.
And then Jordan and Simone, the gymnasts. My daughters are Jordan and Simone.
Yeah, and Marcy Faust and Dr. Faust. And shout out to our UC.
Marcy's been a great ambassador for us at those Olympics.
It's incredible.
Okay. If you lived in an alternative universe, what job would you be doing?
I often think about wanting to be a postman. Like if you could have a job, and no male person, no disrespect. If you could have a job that required less thinking. Sometimes I think academics and other we overthink. And if I could have something, I love to walk. I love the social idea of talking with neighbors. I always talk to them when they come around our house. My wife's uncle is a mailman, and I don't know why, but I always thought that'd be a really interesting job.
That was not the answer I was expecting, but that's a good one. If you could have dinner with anyone, alive or not, who would it be?
That's a great question. I've been thinking about James Baldwin a lot. These open letters and, the fire next time and fire this time. And for some reason, he's kind of top of mind.
That's a fascinating answer. I always wonder if he's the same person in an informal setting as he is on television when he's giving these interviews, and he's really fiery, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So,
and you imagine there's a big difference from his writing. Feels much more intimate than there's a kind of performance that some of those intellectuals were forced into, especially then, right? Like the debating Buckley and these kind of right-wing racists.
Yeah.
I can't imagine what the pressure and,
So you came to us from New Orleans, so I have to ask this question: which is best, East Coast or West Coast?
Well, I'm a Bay Area kid, so I always joke that we came back to the best coast.
Okay. Even though I want people to know I don't think New Orleans is on the coast.
No, we were on the East Coast for a long time. I was teaching at Brown before I was teaching at the University of New Orleans.
Okay.
And we decided no East Coast, but if we were going to raise kids anywhere, it'd be
Back
Bay
here.
Area or New Orleans.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Good. Okay. This is my favorite question to ask every guest. What is on top of your playlist right now?
Ooh, is this? I don't know if this is embarrassing or good, but it's Beyonce. My Elijah's in this Berkeley Parks and Rec camp this summer, and the counselor is a middle school dance teacher, and so she taught them some pretty cool dances, and so this gets requested a lot in my home.
That's a perfect answer. Just means you're a good dad. Now it's your turn. You ask me anything you want.
Yeah, I was asked Elijah on the way on the train up here. I was like, "What do you want to ask the chancellor?" And I heard you were from St. Louis, and I brought you that book on St. Louis because one of my favorite historians called it the broken heart of America in his last book. And so I wonder how growing up there shaped the vision for your work and the work that you've done. How you.
Yeah. Well, first, let me just tell people Elijah's your son.
Yes,
He's
that's
about
right.
to start kindergarten.
That's right.
I'm glad he helped you with your questions. And so I had a great childhood growing up in St. Louis. You don't really know that someplace is different until you live somewhere else, right? So St. Louis has had its challenges over the years. For a while, a lot of the manufacturing left. There used to be a big GM plant that left. A lot of people were affected by that. So there's been some economic challenges. Crime has been a problem. My best friend from high school was the chief of police. He's retired now. And so every time I thought my job was hard, I'd talk to him and realize it's not that hard because he'd have to deal with all this. For many years, St. Louis has been the murder capital of the world. And so gun violence is a huge issue. But at the same time, all of my best memories were from where I grew up and who I grew up with. And St. Louis really shaped my own character and gave me the ambition and the tools to be where I am now. So I'm very grateful for that.
And then we were also thinking, our department is eager to know what your hopes for the Austin and Arutha Goss Presidential Endowed Chair. This is big deal and big news, and we'd love to hear what your hopes for that.
Yeah,
are.
we are also grateful to Daryl and Lois Goss for their generous donation that's allowing us to have the chair. And my thoughts and my ambitions are for us to use that as a tool to recruit a fine scholar, in this field, someone with national, if not international, renown. And I hope that we can do that. I'm looking forward to who we are able to recruit into the chair. So, and I want to get more chairs that we can do similar things with, right? So thanks for sitting down with me, Ben. It's been a fascinating conversation. I've enjoyed it, getting to meet you. And Elijah, he's out there. And to the audience, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on Face to Face. Go Ags.